started. Are we on? All right, welcome to our event, Jury Nullifications, Just Say No to the Law. It's the title for today's event. Of course, welcome everyone to come to yet another one of our Federalist Society events. This is actually, we're scheduled to be the fourth event this week of a mega week. It's actually the third. Anyways, long story. We still hope you'll have fun here. So the format of the debate today, as usual, we have a 12-minute introduction by each speaker. Again, starting with our guest speakers, today is Mr. Shamansky. Then we'll have a 10-minute rebuttal by each speaker in the same order. And finally, we'll have questions and answers for the audience. I'll start with an introduction for each speaker, and then we'll get started. First, Professor Rick Simmons is a graduate of Columbia Law School, where he was a Stone Scholar and a senior editor of the Columbia Law Review. He served just 4 years as an assistant district attorney for New York County and was acting assistant professor at NYU School of Law from June of 2000 until June of 2003. Here at Ohio State, he teaches evidence criminal law and the prosecution practicum and is the author of a terrific law school textbook, Learning Evidence from the Federal Rules to the Courtroom. And Mr. Samuel Shamansky was born in Columbus, Ohio.
No, hold on, I told you I'm not doing any introductions.
No introductions? Mr. Shamansky
I guess I was stuttering when you and I were speaking.
Needs no introduction. He's that good.
Not that I don't need one, I just don't want this kind gentleman to be introducing me. And you just stay right up here with me for
Okay.
a minute. How should we start this off, do you think?
With you.
With maybe
General definition.
general definition. What do you think? Anybody have an idea of a general definition for the topic of jury nullification? Mr. Peter Ruffing, who's tried many jury trials, and he's an alum. And I think his son goes to law school here. In fact, he and I have had many trials together. He's from Delaware County. Everybody want to give Mr. Ruffing a round of applause, please? Thank you. Okay, what do you think the definition of jury nullification is?
My own view is that a jury nullification is a situation in which a jury refuses to convict a criminal defendant.
Even though Mr. Ruffing has proved every element beyond a reasonable doubt?
Yes.
Okay, and what do you think of that?
I think it's great. That's why we wanted to have a debate.
Perfect. Grab a seat. Thank you. Now, let's talk a little bit, since I have 12 minutes, about the history. Anybody familiar with the history of jury nullification other than Professor Simmons? Come on, pipe right up. Anybody know? Okay, what I'm told is that Bushell's case in 1670. Anybody know who William Penn was? Okay, founded Pennsylvania, right? Got a state named after him. He was arrested in England and charged with violating the Conventicle Act. Does that make sense, Professor?
Sure.
This act forbade any religious gathering greater than 5 people which was unaffiliated with the Church of England. So that's our statute. Now, how do you think the colonists felt about that statute? Anybody have a clue?
They didn't like
You don't have a clue, or they didn't like
it. They
it?
didn't like that.
Okay, and why not? Ms. Moritz here with the pizza?
Because one of the reasons they came to America was to escape religious prosecution.
Right, so we have a statute on the books that they just flat out don't like, right? So when this gentleman, Mr. Penn, was acquitted, what does the smart trial judge do under those circumstances? Who's got any ideas? You?
Well, he would, as a matter of law, say to reverse the jury's verdict.
Oh no, there's no such law as reversing the jury's verdict. No. It's a good thought, if you're an anarchist. Anybody else? You? Come on, what does a smart trial judge do in such a situation back in the colonial times? Mr. Penn has just been cut free by this rogue, runaway jury. Hangs who?
Mr. Beck.
You're getting closer. I like you. You in the hat. But you didn't think this was just, I'm going to get up here and pontificate, did you?
No.
Okay, well then give me an answer.
I mean, if I was a Dutch person with the colonial sense of it, I would duck and hide.
Duck and hide? No. You?
Someone say J&OB?
No, nobody said that. That, I think, is a civil concept, from what I'm told. Right. Yes, sir.
Would you find a jury member that did it and made their lives hell?
Well, that's even closer. What he did is he put the entire jury in jail. Right?
Yes, right.
That makes sense, doesn't it? So, that was from the case from which this entire concept sprung, as it were. At least that's what I'm told. Now, following this episode, there was a groundswell and a notion that jurors were not only the finders of fact, but really the true guardians of justice and truth and liberty as they perceived it. So, what does that mean for us moving forward a little bit? For those of you who are truly Federalists, there was a debate during the ratification of the Constitution between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists regarding the independence of the jury. The first Chief Justice of the United States, John Jay, wrote, quote, "It is presumed that juries are the best judges of facts. It is, on the other hand, presumed that courts are the best judges of law. But still both objects are within your power of decision," which basically says it's completely up to the jury and the law be damned. Now, how does that play out in modern day practice? What's the first step of a trial proceeding? Oh, no, oh, no, come on up here. You should have never said that to me. Come on, right here beside me, please. Come on. I'm not asking. I'm the guest speaker. Another bite of pizza? Come on up, this will be fun. You're not going to regret this. What's your name?
Erin.
Where are you from, Erin?
Bowling Green?
Oh, Bowling Green?
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
You know Dave Waddle,
The name sounds familiar.
1972 800-meter champion, probably the best 800 meters ever run in an Olympic event. Ringing a bell?
No.
Okay, Erin has been wrongly accused of, what's your favorite crime? What's the last crime you committed? Oh, I'm sorry. Let's just say it's an OVI charge, okay? That's something that's near and dear to most law students' hearts, right? So you're charged with drunk driving. What do? You call me on the phone. What do you say? Ring, ring, ring. Say Sam.
Hi, Sam.
Hi, Erin. Erin from Bowling Green, 1L at OSU?
That's right.
You've been charged with drunk driving?
Yeah.
Did you blow?
No, I did not.
Smart girl. And you can't afford an OVI conviction, can you?
Absolutely not.
It'll really screw up your resume, won't it?
Yeah. I know.
Okay. And we fast forward 3 months. We've been through all the pre-trials, all the BS. The trial process is about to start. What's the first thing we do?
Plead not guilty.
We've already done that. We've
I don't know.
entered it. Yes, you do know. Who do you want to decide your case? A jury of your peers?
Ah.
Oh.
Yes.
What's the magic word?
We'd like to get a good jury.
We would like to get a good jury. Now, how are we going to get a good jury? Remember, Erin is probably guilty as hell, right? You've been drinking.
I don't drink at all.
Would you play along? You've been drinking, right? You were
Heavily.
tanked,
Heavily.
right?
Yeah.
You were cruising without your lights on.
Yeah.
Probably going the wrong way on Summit. Always do that. Yet you need a break, right? And lo and behold, as we board you this jury, I've got 4 or 5 of your classmates on there, right? That makes sense to you?
That sounds good for me.
Okay, so what do we want to instill in this jury? What concepts are important to us in order to get you obviously guilty acquitted?
You know, it could have happened to anybody.
Exactly, that's good, right? We're all in the same boat together. That's starting to sound like a nullification argument, right? What else? The punishment's overkill. I can never get it off my record. It's going to screw up my employment search.
Yeah, really hard.
It's the first time I've ever done this. I don't really drink, right?
Yeah, we just try to find something.
Something we could
you
all
wouldn't
latch.
be able to-
Exactly, because we know that Prosecutor Simmons here is going to convict you 100 times over if the jury follows the law, right? Do we want that?
No,
Okay, good job. You don't feel angry with me, do you?
not really.
Okay, not really. That's a euphemism for what?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so the point is, how do you, in a subtle way, get across to a jury that the law is either overbearing, unfairly applied, harsh, unacceptable? How does one do that? That's the trick of jury nullification. And in order to do that, you need to be focusing on general topics, such as, anybody want to get into a little voir dire? I know you do. Come on up.
Me?
You, impossible. I've only got 12 minutes.
6 now.
6, thank you.
We don't pull anyone off stage if you're...
That's okay. I'm still going to follow the rules.
Okay.
What's your name?
Brittany.
Brittany. Okay, so I'm a juror. You're the lawyer voir diring me. Go ahead, ask a few questions. Let's presume for a minute. Let's figure out a fact pattern, shall we? Heaven forbid, being the father of 2 daughters, I've had one that's been raped. And I went off the deep end. What did I do? I went into the county jail, used my bar card, went in there and strangled him to death. Seemed fair, wouldn't it? To most people. But Prosecutor Simmons, elected county prosecutor Simmons, he can't let that slide, can he? He's not going to let me go to the county jail and be judge, jury, and executioner, is he? No. Okay? You're trying to save my ass. I'm a juror.
No, I don't know.
You do know. Start thinking. What do you want to ask me? What kind of person, what kind of mindset do you need? Let's do it the other way around. Brittany? Do you think there are situations in which people just need to do the right thing?
Yes.
And let's talk about some of those situations. Have you ever suffered a personal tragedy?
No.
But have you known people that have? You ever known somebody who's been the victim of a horrible, violent crime?
No.
Oh, God. Why don't you just say yes? Okay, and those people, how did they feel? Was it a loved one?
Yes.
In fact, I read on your questionnaire that your sister had been raped.
Yes.
And tell me a little bit about that experience as a sister and as a friend and as a loved one.
It made me angry, upset, just very emotional at the time.
Do you remember the day you got the call from the hospital that your sister had been violated?
I do.
And what was that like?
Oh, it was just horrible. Kind of my whole world stopped at that moment.
And how did your mom feel?
She was just in tears. I mean, so emotional. We really couldn't talk to her.
And what was it like when you went to visit your sister at the hospital?
Really hard. Just, I didn't know what to say to her or anything to do.
And let me ask you a question. Now that you're thinking about it, what were some of the things that your sister was going to face through the judicial system since she'd already been violated? She was going to have to talk about this horrible sexual experience in front of strangers?
Yeah.
And how'd that make her feel?
She really closed up. She's not a person who really wants to talk about anything that personal, and something like about this level just was too much for her.
Perfect. See, what a good job, Brittany. You are doing a damn good job. Thank you.
Who's the strike?
Okay. Overruled. Okay, now do you see what we're getting at there? What we're doing is we're layering things that are sort of innocuous, yet really are getting to the heart of the defense. I, as the father, I just got to have an eye for an eye, right? We might talk a little bit about religion. We might talk about the Bible. We're going to talk about everything but the law, right? And why is that?
Because we don't want the law involved?
We don't want the law involved, do we? Because I'm clearly guilty for going in there and strangling the rapist, right?
Right.
But who can blame me? Anybody? Professor Simmons. But I mean anybody in the jury pool. Who doesn't understand the desire to just rip some rapist's head off and choke the life out of him as he looks at you and takes his last breath in the county jail where he belongs? Right? So that's what you got to get through to the jury in a subtle yet effective and unequivocal way. Make sense? Now, who has an idea about cases right now where prosecutors like former prosecutor Simmons might have a difficult time convicting people even though the law says you're guilty? What are some cases or some locales where that might... Can anybody think of an historical case in the last 15 or 20 years that may have involved a football player? Anybody seen the Chappelle Show? The voir dire skit with Dave getting voir dired for the O.J. Simpson trial? Nobody's ever seen that? You've seen it, haven't you? It's hilarious, isn't it? Who doesn't have a bloody glove or two, right? I mean, was that one of the ultimate jury nullification cases we've seen lately? I mean, could a guy been any more arguably guilty on the evidence? What about Rodney King? Pull the guy out of his truck, beat the daylights out of him on video, and everybody walks. Anything else? Anybody else can think of? What about marijuana laws? Anybody read about jurisdictions where it's impossible? What'd you read or what have you heard?
Well, in Paul Butler's book, Let's Get Free, there's talking a lot about like nonviolent drug possession crimes, like black communities, strong black communities.
Right, people are sick of it, right? And they're not going to convict. They're going to make it very difficult. Even though the law says X, Y, and Z, they're going to do exactly as they please. So, my 12 minutes up?
I don't know.
Who's keeping time?
No one.
Okay, I feel like my time ought to be up. I'm going to yield the floor to my colleague and esteemed prosecutor, Professor Simmons. Let's give him a big hand.
Thank you. And I want to thank Ahmad for always putting me up against the most colorful, exciting, interesting speakers, and I can come up and just sort of, be myself. And so it's always a tough act to follow. We actually did have an anarchist here a couple weeks ago that I haven't followed. So, all right. Well, I'm not going to call on people, but I would love to have input if people do want to volunteer. I guess my argument is more along the lines of whether or not we should have jury nullification, whether it's a good idea for society. Probably clear it's good for the defendant, and I think that's fine. But to me, I think it's a bad idea generally. And I guess there's two steps to my argument. One is whether or not we actually should have any mechanisms at all in our criminal justice system to exempt people from lawful punishment. In other words, someone who is obviously guilty, should there be any way that that person should actually not be punished? And I think that's something that Sam and I would agree with. I think the answer is yes. I think any criminal justice system has to have a way that we exempt people from lawful punishment. For one reason, there's too many laws. We can't enforce them all. Legislatures go crazy and make everything they can a crime. Looks good. They over-criminalize so many things. Something that you do could be a crime. And I think we have to have some point at which someone's exercised discretion to decide that we shouldn't actually be convicting somebody. And more fundamentally, I think you have to have some kind of a human input. Otherwise, you just have a machine that you plug in the elements and you give a sentence and then you're done. There clearly has to be some point along the line where somebody, an individual, is looking at this, exercising judgment, saying, yes, this person is guilty, but we should not convict them. They're legally guilty, but we should exempt them from punishment. I had a case in my when I was prosecuting in New York. There was and I'll just tell you the brief story. There was a kid who was about to join. He was actually in the military already. He came back after 6 months of military. He came back to hang with some of his old friends, which turned out to be a bad idea. His old friend got in the car. His old friends they drove up to a bad neighborhood in New York, and it turns out that he got some drugs there. Big sort of bag of crack cocaine. Put the big bag. There's a bag with all the baggies in it. Tossed in the car. He's like, okay, I gotta get out of here. This is not good for me. I can't be here. So they're about to take him somewhere. All of a sudden, the police lights show up in the back rearview mirror. The car gets pulled over. What does he do? He panics. He's with his friends. Doesn't want them in trouble. He takes the bag and he stuffs it under his seat. And that action alone, the cops see that. He's probably guilty of constructive possession anyway, because he's in a car with the drugs. But that makes them arrest him. He's possessing drugs, enough drugs for intent to sell, a felony. So here you have a kid who is clearly guilty in the law. The law is clear that if you know about the drugs, he knew about the drugs, he's in the car with the drugs, he possesses these drugs, that he is guilty under the law, that as written by a legislature, he deserves punishment. But there is a good argument that he shouldn't be punished. Here's someone who has worked his way out of a very bad situation. He graduated from high school, almost none of his friends did. He joined the Army. He's now a model soldier, as far as we can tell. He's serving his country. He wants to make something of his life, unlike most of the people he hangs out with. He made one very small mistake. So I think there are examples like that. I have lots of examples written down of people who might need some kind of mercy or some kind of exemption from what we think of as lawful punishment. And the question to me then, who should that be? Should it be the jury that hears the case, or should it be someone else? And there are essentially a lot of steps along the way where we could exercise this discretion to exempt someone from lawful punishment. So let's go through the steps and see where we do. Someone first has to arrest these people, the police, right? The police a lot of times don't arrest people even though they are committing crimes. They just say, oh, just move along here, I'm not going to bother with this, but don't do this again. We've all been pulled over for speeding, maybe all of us. And sometimes you get the ticket, sometimes you talk your way out of it, sometimes, and that's a trivial example, but a lot of times police officers don't make the arrest, even though they could. After the police get the case, it goes to the prosecutor. The prosecutor decides whether or not to prosecute the case, sometimes drops charge altogether. In my clinic, as Lindsay here knows, we frequently will drop a case if we don't think, even though we can prove the case, simply don't think it's worth the time, we don't think the person deserves punishment, we leave it alone. If it's a felony, the case will go to a grand jury. Grand jury has to decide whether or not this person deserves to be punished. And so they can make the defendant can come and testify in the grand jury, in some jurisdictions anyway, and tell his or her story, and that's the way we can, they can decide if this is something worthwhile or not. It goes to a judge and a jury eventually, if it goes that far. The jury, as we've heard, could nullify. The judge could always throw the verdict out if he or she wants to, even though the person's legally guilty, could throw it out. Finally, the person's convicted. We have one other individual, the governor, or the president, I suppose, in a federal case, could pardon or this person and make sure that they don't suffer any punishment. Could say that the crime essentially never occurred. So we have a lot of spots along the way where someone who's clearly guilty, and we're going to assume the person's guilty. We had that assumption, Sam had that assumption too. So assume the person's guilty, A lot of ways along the way where we can decide this person is not going to be punished even though they are guilty of the crime. The question to me then is, what point should we have this discretion to not punish somebody? And I'm going to submit to you the worst possible place for that is with a lay jury. Of all those actors I've talked about, the police, the prosecutor, the grand jury, the judge, the jury, the governor or executive, the worst possible place to exercise discretion is with a lay jury. It's not surprising people who know me or people who are in my clinic, I think the primary place should happen is with the prosecutor in the prosecuting office. I think they're the ones that are trained to do this. They're the ones that can receive training on how to do this properly, on what factors you should take into consideration when you decide whether or not someone should not be punished in this. Oh, I see Kate there too. Okay, another prosecutor. Good. All right. I can see you hiding in the back. But you're in the clinic, so you sympathize with you understand what I'm saying. Oh, good. All right. They're also professional. They can act reasonably. They're not going to act based on emotion or based on maybe some sort of irrational argument. They can look at a case and think, okay, is this the best thing to do in the case? And they can have consistency across the jurisdiction. They can set out office policies. You can have someone in the office who deals with these kind of issues. You go to your bureau chief, you go to your supervisor and say, do you think we should charge in this case? What do you think? Because one of the key problems we have with this idea of exempting people from lawful punishment is consistency. We want individualized justice. We want each person to be treated differently based on their background and so on. We also want to have some consistency across the jurisdiction. A lay jury obviously can't do that. They only see the one case. A prosecuting office can do that. They can try and have some kind of guidelines as to when it's appropriate to exempt somebody. What facts should you look at? And finally, the prosecutor is an elected official, or at least the head prosecutor is, and is responsive to the people. Maybe there are jurisdictions where some juries aren't going to convict of marijuana crimes or not going to convict of certain kinds of crimes. But that's hit and miss. Some juries will, some juries won't. And if they don't or they do, there's no recourse whatsoever. If there's a prosecutor that is or is not exempting some people from lawful punishment, then that's going to come out. People are going to make the decision in the ballot box whether or not they think the person making good decisions or not. I think it was the San Francisco DA, Terrence Hallinan, about 10 years ago, basically said that when he became prosecutor, he was the chief prosecutor for all San Francisco, he wasn't going to prosecute certain crimes. Not going to prosecute vagrancy crimes. Not going to prosecute marijuana crimes. Not going to do it. If you don't like it, vote me out. It turns out they did, that's him. And I can imagine, a jurisdiction maybe smaller, at least more liberal than San Francisco, which probably does exist somewhere. That might be fine. That might be fine with the people. That's the decision that people are making, not literally randomly chosen 6 to 12 individuals that have to be sitting on the jury. There are other places where you can exercise this power. The police, they're not generally as educated as the prosecutors are, obviously, but they also can be trained. They can be guided as to when it's appropriate to make an arrest, when it's appropriate to let something slide. They have much more experience and knowledge about how these cases work out. They see hundreds and hundreds of cases, unlike the lay jury sees one. So they can compare and decide what's really worth going forward with, what's not worth going forward with. They know much more about the true cost of the crime, the true damage to the victim that occurs with crime, or the lack thereof. They can see, yeah, it's on the books, you're not supposed to smoke marijuana here, but really you're not bothering anybody, just move along. Or they can see, actually, the marijuana trade here is actually very bad for this community. Look at what's going on. There's so much other crime going around here because it's now a drug community. They can make that decision with much more knowledge about what's going on, what the crime actually does. So I could put the police maybe second. The governor maybe third. That's the most political of these actors. But the governor also has the most amount of resources. In theory, he or she could put any amount of resources towards deciding whether or not a person deserves to be punished or not. And certainly can look at this with a practiced eye as to who deserves it and who doesn't. I put the grand jury next as someone who has a body who could exercise this discretion. The grand jury, in fact, has a long history of being the voice of the people, of deciding not to indict someone, even though they are clearly guilty. Grand jury, the police, and the prosecutor, I think, are all better than the lay jury for another reason. They stop the process right away. I'm not sure how it is beneficial, obviously, but it's not as beneficial. You have to go through the entire arrest, investigation, prosecution, the trial itself, and then finally you're exonerated by the lay jury. The grand jury, one of its purposes is to start at the very beginning and say, hey, is this worth going forward with? If we put the grand jury and give the grand jury that power instead of the jury, the grand jury then can then make its can then stop the process before it gets any further, before a formal accusation is even set forward and destroying someone's reputation and causing all those resources of hiring someone expensive like Mr. Shamansky there to represent you. You can then go ahead and stop it before that happens. Finally, the judge, at least the judge would be professional if the judge wants to throw out a verdict because he or she thinks this is not the just thing to do. I would see the judge doing that certainly before we should allow this jury to do it. And there's a couple other points about that too. If you think about what we're doing when we're exempting someone from lawful punishment, we are by definition making a decision based on something other than the relevant facts and the law in the case. All right? What is a lay jury supposed to hear? A lay jury is supposed to hear just the relevant facts and the law in the case. They're not getting other information about the case. At least they shouldn't. Right? So if we have, the example I have of the kid in the military, does that come out that he's in the military? Does it come out that he came up from this bad neighborhood, that he's the only one of his family to ever finish high school? He's the only one of his friends that didn't join a gang and start selling drugs? How are you going to get that in as a defense attorney? You could try. I'll stop you from doing that as a prosecutor. I don't see how that's relevant to whether or not you actually had drugs on that day. Even the example of the person, when you go and kill someone because they raped your daughter, you might want to try and keep that rape out. Maybe that's not relevant to the case, whether or not he's guilty of committing that crime. You're going to try and keep that information from the jury. So I don't know how they're supposed to decide, sort of normative moral guilt when they don't get that information. And finally, one other point before I stop and give a chance for rebuttal, which is something that is sort of a pet peeve of mine about this so-called right to jury nullification. And I was hoping to use that term, and he didn't, so I can't pick on Sam for this. But okay, so that just makes me mad. So why do we use that term? Because people say, oh, there's a right to jury nullification. Why is there a right? Well, because when the jury does it, there's no recourse, which is true. You have double jeopardy rules. Once a jury, we can't, unfortunately, like they did with William Penn's jury, put them in jail. If the jury decides not to convict, even though the prosecutor has proven his or her case beyond reasonable doubt, where there's no recourse at all, the person is completely free. And I can see that. I don't think that makes it a right. That simply means it's a crime that we cannot detect or punish. When jurors become part of a jury, they take an oath. The oath says, if the prosecutor proves his or her case beyond reasonable doubt, you must convict. Which means that any jury that actually does engage in jury nullification is guilty of contempt of court. And we can never prove it because we can never know why they didn't convict. It could be they didn't find beyond reasonable doubt. We can't talk about the discussions. That's protected. The jury deliberations are rightfully protected. So we can't ever prove it. But that doesn't mean it's the right thing to do or they have some right to do it. It means simply they're getting away with a crime that we can't stop. Contrast that, for example, the grand jury instructions. The grand jury instructions say if you find that that the elements of the crime are made out by there's reasonable cause to believe a crime is committed, then you may indict, but you don't have to indict. When a grand jury decides not to proceed with the case, that's not illegal. That's part of their role, their historic role, as well as their current role. They don't have to indict if they don't want to. So for all those reasons, I think if you look at when we should be doing this, when we should be showing mercy, showing individualized justice, I think that there's a lot of people, institutions that could do that, but I really hope that it wouldn't be the lay jury that does it. So I'll yield the floor now for a rebuttal, and I might have a couple more things to say after that. But.
Okay, where do we begin with this rebuttal? Who here, for half an instant, believes the following? That grand juries, what was the term you used? I should have written that down. I just couldn't believe it. I was almost falling in. Oh, are the voice of the people. I did write it down. Now, that is what I would term, if you don't mind me using a legal term, unmitigated horseshit. Okay? And let's talk about the reality. Let's talk about the truth of the situation. The grand jury is the tool of the prosecutor, of course. Am I allowed, as the high-priced mouthpiece, as Professor Simmons so politely refers to me?
I didn't say you weren't worth it.
I didn't say that you didn't say I wasn't worth it. You said I was expensive for some reason. How do you know that? I mean, I haven't represented you yet.
I assume, you look,
I look what?
You look expensive, right?
Where were we? Am I allowed into the grand jury room? Are any of the people allowed into the grand jury room? No? Who is allowed in there?
Prosecutor.
And who else? Cops, right? The alleged victims? Or anybody else a prosecutor wants to call, right? Right? Right. Hardly the voice of the people, with all due respect. And what really happens in a grand jury? What do they say? A grand jury will indict a ham sandwich. Where does that come from, I wonder? That might be the voice of the hog farmer speaking. But the point is that the grand jury is the worst possible place to attempt to filter out cases that really should never be brought. Now, having said that, in theory, which has nothing to do with practice, maybe grand juries are independent. But the reality is there's no way to be independent when you're only getting one side of the story. And you're only getting one side of the story when the prosecutor controls what the grand jury hears. Unless you've got one really righteous prosecutor. Right? Right. Now, so let's forget about that for a minute. Then there's this hierarchy that Professor Simmons suggests. Okay, the cops are in a great position to decide on the spur of the moment who to lock up and who not to lock up. Let me tell you what cops are good at doing. They are good at exercising discretion. I've been dealing with and representing cops and beating up on them in court for 25 years. And generally speaking, they're in an excellent position to make the sort of easy calls. The dope in the glove box, you're drunk, they give you a ride home. They know how to do the right thing. But I'm talking about a major crime. I'm talking about a crime where there's a dead victim, where there's somebody raped, where there's somebody abused. Cops aren't in a position to do that, nor should they ever be. Their job is to make the arrest, free from constraints, free from worrying about who needs a break and who doesn't in the tough cases. That's not their job. They're not trained like that, nor should they be worried about that. Their job is to get the criminals locked up and let the system deal with it. Period. Now, the notion that the prosecutor is more professional or somehow more in tune than 12 members of a jury, that is called the height of elitism. Now, I'm not saying that Rick Simmons is an elitist just because he went to Columbia. My guess is he worked his ass off. He's got an extremely big legal mind. He's a great communicator. He was an absolutely perfectly qualified candidate to lead the law review. I don't doubt his abilities and his intelligence for a minute. But the notion that he is trying to sell you is ridiculous, with all due respect. Prosecutors have one job, generally speaking, and that is to get reelected. They're human beings like everybody else. They need that job. You don't have many independently wealthy people prosecuting criminals for a living. It just doesn't happen. These people thrive on power. They thrive on recognition. They thrive on managing lawyers and running around like they're big shots. By and large, that's what prosecutors thrive upon. That's why they take the job. For relatively low pay, yet lots of notoriety, lots of decision-making, power. And what does power do?
Corrupt.
Corrupts. Of course it corrupts. How could it not? And if you brush aside what Professor Simmons would like you to consider, the role of law, the role of an ordered society, the reality is when you're dealing with human beings and particular fact patterns, that there is no better place for the truth to be discovered and analyzed and a just result imposed than by 12 citizens from the locale in which you are charged. Period. And you don't just believe me. Listen to these arguments. The cops should make the decision. Oh, gee, if the cops screw it up, the prosecutor should. Oh, gee, if the prosecutor screws it up, the trial judge. What, trial judge? You can count the judges with real backbone on one hand. And that's the truth, because they're politicians. And they're human beings. And nobody wants to lose their job and stick their neck out for some criminal, or accused criminal, or convicted criminal. Doesn't happen. That's why juries retain the power to do the right thing. Case in point, I represented a Columbus cop years ago who went inside, committed a burglary, grabbed a 14-year-old kid out of the house and beat his ass in the front yard. Why? Because Mr. 14-year-old sold his kid marijuana. Flat beat his ass. Didn't hospitalize him, but beat him up. Pissed off. So he committed an ag burg and an assault. And naturally, I was representing him. So, I went for what we'll call judge nullification, because I had a wonderful judge on this case who A, loved cops and B, hated drugs. So I got a really good thing going. Prosecutor's up there, battering away, puts on all the evidence. had witnesses, and my guy even admitted, I went in there on the stand. I went in there, I grabbed the kid, I was angry, and I gave him a whipping in the front yard. And what did the judge do? Say it. What? Of course, found him not guilty. Why wouldn't he? He figured this is what that kid deserved. And what he was really thinking is, that's what I would have probably done. I'd have walked in that house and given that kid an ass beating. Because that's what he deserved. Now, Professor Simmons would say, oh no, no. The prosecutor's office should have done this. The governor should have done that. But the truth was, the reality was, my guy was charged. His career was on the line. And he had to rely on jury nullification, or else he was done. Period. And that's just the way of the world, like it or not. And I hope you all like it. What else? Remember this. Professor Simmons raises a good point. How do you get all this information in? Well, first of all, you got to have a judge, hopefully, that's sympathetic. If you don't, you got to play it down low and get it all in an opening statement while he's objecting. Say it anyway. What's the worst that's going to happen to you? You're going to get objected to. The judge is going to say, oh, jury, don't disregard. Of course they're not going to. They're going to listen to every word you say. There'll be no disregarding it. And the reality is, they understand anyway. They're all reading the paper when they're not supposed to. They're following the press coverage when they're not supposed to. They're on their cell phones when they're not supposed to. They're talking to their spouses when they're not supposed to. Believe me, they are infiltrated with everything they shouldn't know. Guaranteed. That's the way it happens. I've been in front of a lot of juries. There's nothing wrong with that. You just know the rules going in and deal with it accordingly.
Oh, sure. All right, a couple of points. First of all, to the charge I'm an elitist. Okay, yeah, I agree with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think there's anything wrong with people who are trained, educated, have experience making the important decisions in our society. Elitist doesn't there might be some negative connotations. I don't think it's all negative, and I think it's fine to make the most qualified people in charge of making these decisions. A couple other points. We might have to disagree on certain facts. The characterization of prosecutors, obviously, you can see them how you want, whether or not they're there to do justice, whether they're there to make the right decision in each case, whether or not they're all power-hungry people who only go after the most amount of convictions they can get. I have a different vision of that based on my...
One question, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Did you ever participate in a perp walk?
No. As a
office? Did your office?
My office?
Your office?
Perp walk.
Tell them what a perp walk is real quick, now shut up.
Perp walk, well, as I understand it, it's not that I ever organized one, is when you arrest someone in full view of cameras and so on, so you can walk them through, and they get publicity as they're being arrested and taken into the police van or whatever.
Right. Your office participated in that.
They might have.
Okay.
I mean, there are a lot of, I could list off things defense attorneys did.
I'm out of order, I'm sorry.
No, I didn't realize there was an order anymore. Which I guess brings me to my next point. And this goes back to the issue of the old saying, you want a nation of laws or of men and women, right? They said men, I'll say men and women. I prefer a nation of laws. I'm not sure what society we're going to have here. I guess we all agree that if a rapist should be just strangled in their sleep, and people sell drugs should be beaten up. The vigilante should roam the streets, do what they want, as long as most people think it's probably okay. We can live as though we're like 1850, the Wild West. You do something wrong, I get to shoot you for it. I don't agree with that. I guess I don't find these examples myself sympathetic. I think that's going too far to individualize justice, where each individual victim gets to decide, that what they do is going to be justified. As long as they can convince 12 people, well, then we'll suspend the law for that person. Do you want to? Yeah.
I guess my question would be then, I don't know if Paul Butler or moving from Professor Alexander, where it's not individual, it's like a systemic, the laws by the community have decided to be unjust and unjustly applied, and so it's sort of an alternative to maybe a political malfunction where the laws aren't going to be overturned because of, the politics of the situation. Is that more palatable?
Yeah, the institutional sort of systemic wide problems with laws, I think that's a much stronger argument. So, for example, I think we brought up the marijuana laws, where in California, for a while in California, they did legalize marijuana for all intents and purposes. You can get a prescription for it with no problem, and you can also, if you are caught with it, it's something like a $50 fine, like having no muffler on your car or something. And the federal government was trying to challenge this. They wanted to actually arrest people, bring them up on federal charges for having marijuana. It turned out they never did that. They actually went after them in civil court to get to sue them for this. And the reason was they weren't going to be able to find a jury to convict people of convicting marijuana. They knew it, of possessing marijuana. So they had to sort of go around that. And that's a case where you have systemic-wide, statewide, essentially, people are tired of these sort of federal drug laws, and they want to make a statement there. And I could see with the concern about minorities in jail and being prosecuted and imprisoned at a higher rate than others, and how that could bother people too, and rightfully so. My response to that still would be, what is the worst body you can turn to fix that problem? It's the random 12 people that happen to sit on one case. Right? You don't like the problem. I think there are other places in the system to deal with that. You know, again, and you know, being political is not necessarily a bad thing. If the governor is still supporting these laws, you can vote the governor out. If the prosecutor is still aggressively pursuing these laws, you can vote the prosecutor out. There are ways the community can signal their displeasure with certain laws through what I would call the proper channels, through other channels at least. And I agree those are imperfect. These are all imperfect ways of individualizing justice, but there's still on a spectrum of how good they are and how bad they are. And I think the worst possible way to do that is with the lay jurors, especially when something systemic. When some jurors might not. If you actually want to change how mercy is allocated, what crimes actually shouldn't be prosecuted, I would go to the prosecutor's office first. Throughout the whole jurisdiction, let's make sure we change that, and try and convince the elected officials there that that's something they shouldn't do. Go ahead.
I mean, it doesn't sound like you're actually really that much against jury nullification. I mean, I agree. Like, if we can get the prosecutors and the police on board to change the way that, especially drug crimes are prosecuted, then we shouldn't use jury nullification. But I think the facts of like the last 20 years have shown that those aren't going to change. So then, if our last recourse is jury nullification, then
I guess if I accept your premise, then I would agree with you. If there's no way to work through to train police, to elect new prosecutors, to send messages to those vehicles, then I think, yeah, that would be your last resort. I guess I don't agree that you can't make legitimate changes that actually a majority of people want. You can't do that through the other institutions. I mean, that's just a factual disagreement. The two other points, and I wanted to have open to questions. One is that even though we don't have jury nullification itself, might be quite rare, the fact that some jurors do believe in jury nullification ends up in a lot of wasted resources. You can hang a jury with one person that believes in jury nullification, decide to hang a jury. Happened to me twice in my career after week-long trials, multi-day trials. One jury decides, well, I can't vote for this, I just think it's wrong. And they argue about it, yell about it for 3 more days, and then that person holds out. We have to redo the entire thing. So encouraging, it's not always the 12 jurors that do this all together. It's usually 1 or 2 jurors that just stop the whole process from happening. And because we need unanimous juries in most cases, all it does is waste everyone's time. And the final point, I always go back to the history of this, and there might be some great history about William Penn and religious persecution and so on. But there's also a much darker history of jury nullification. There were all white juries that wouldn't convict white people of killing black people in the South. That was jury nullification. Today, I can imagine bigots on the jury decide not to convict in a gay rights bashing, in a gay bashing case, because they think the guy had it coming to him. I don't see any way of preventing that in the jury level. Again, you have prosecutors or police who are acting in a racist, bigoted way. We can find that out. We can root that out and cure the institution, if possible. Let's make an attempt. If you have lay jurors that have these kind of ideas, we're stuck. We're stuck with essentially no justice happening because the jurors have that bigoted belief structure. Let me stop there. I've both gone on, and I don't know how you want to do questions.
Yeah, we'll just have questions for both speakers.
I'm just sit back here.
Okay.
How are we supposed to know if you're kidding or not? There's really no way to know.
Okay, who's got questions? Lindsay.
Okay, you say that juries are in the best position to do the jury nullification, but what about the fact that juries are really the only ones in the process constrained by things like the rules of evidence and the exclusionary rules? So juries aren't really getting the whole story the way a prosecutor can, or police officers even, or the grand jury can.
Right. So the notion that less is really less as opposed to less is more translates into adverse or, what's the word I'm looking for? Results that make no sense, right, from a justice standpoint, because they haven't heard what? What didn't they hear?
Un-Mirandized confessions where the guy just happened to be in the backseat of the car and the cops were talking to each other and he just starts talking.
But doesn't jury nullification presuppose that the defendant is guilty as charged and evidence shows it overwhelmingly? Good point. Sorry about that, Federalist Society.
Sorry.
Right?
I suppose.
Well, no suppositions here. I mean, come on, you've got a strong mind. You're making a point. Let's talk about it. What you're saying is that juries are ignorant, and thus they shouldn't be allowed to do anything except robotically follow the instructions as given by a judge.
Well, what about like criminal histories? A lot of times that doesn't get into
Right.
the jury, and the prosecutors know that this guy is a career criminal, but for some reason it doesn't make its way to the
no,
jury,
not for
and
some
that makes a
reason.
big difference.
The only way it doesn't get in is if A, it's not an element of the offense, such as an enhanceable offense or 3 strikes here. They're going to hear about priors then, or the defendant doesn't take the stand and thus can't be cross-examined on his or her record. Okay, so the jury doesn't hear about that. But I mean, again, you're talking about issues that would result in a finding of not guilty for reasons.
But what if they decided to find him not guilty because they don't think this crime is that big of a deal, but they don't realize that this guy has an entire history of similar crimes that never show up?
So punish somebody for their past, not for the crime under which
Well, if
they're
we're
charged.
talking about moralistic normative guilt, someone who is a career criminal has more than a guy who does it for the first time, doesn't he?
Right, but when you think about it practically, why do juries nullify?
Because they don't think it's that big of a deal right now. But they
Or-
might if they knew this guy is a
or-
career criminal.
Well, exactly, but the reason that we don't allow that information in is because we want juries to at least be able to exercise independent, rational judgment about a person. Because it's very hard to separate that scumbag's past from the scumbag, right? Right, so, I mean, just as a general rule of law, that's not going to happen in a civilized society. I mean, the point is that you're going to have 12 people focusing on the here and now, not the last 20 years. So what you're saying is a jury might get hoodwinked into nullifying it for some piece of garbage that doesn't deserve it.
Can I jump in for a second?
Yeah,
Just 'cause
absolutely.
it seems like you're trying to have it both ways here, frankly, because we've just heard over the last 20 minutes about all these tricks you're going to use as a defense attorney to get in all the good things about your client, or all the mitigating circumstances of the client. But then if we try and say, well, the prosecutor should then be able to do tricks to make sure that they learn about the bad things about the client, well, that's totally inappropriate.
It is totally
If the
inappropriate.
jury, so, if a jury is only supposed to hear all the good mitigating parts of the crime, and the good sympathetic parts about the client, and then maybe lead to nullification, why shouldn't it get the full story, which they can't get, about maybe how the person's not such a great guy, about how maybe they do have a priority, maybe it's not such a mitigating crime, maybe the harm to the victim was more than we're allowed to prove.
And the answer to that question is because we're doing this in a sort of a covert fashion, legally speaking, and we would much rather have the overzealous prosecutor restrained than the overzealous defense lawyer restrained.
I
That
agree,
just
because
happens to be the truth.
we're already talking about people who we know are guilty. We're conceding these people are already guilty.
I mean,
So-
we used the good example of me being out of my mind with anger and strangling the rapist. Now, you're going to have people who are going to say, you know what, that's what that piece of shit deserved. He deserved to be strangled. He deserved to have daddy go in there and not rely on the governor, not rely on somebody else, but go in and look that guy eye to eye and choke the life out of him. In fact,
He doesn't deserve due process of law in a court of law.
He does deserve it.
Sentence opposed,
he
opposed by
deserves.
law.
I agree. He deserves all that. What if I'm choking the daylights out of the wrong guy? Jurors are going to pick up on that. Oh my God, that's the wrong guy. They'll know. But Mr. Rapist who raped my daughter, and there's no question about it. Those are the kinds of cases that get nullified. I can assure you that if you were to go through and do an empirical study of all nullified cases, the jury reached the right decision. It's not like they let Jack the Ripper go. Believe me. Jack the Rippers get buried underneath the penitentiary 99.9% of the time, and the rest of the time, innocent people are getting buried underneath the penitentiary. Yes, sir.
Well, I was going to say that I think with jury nullification, a lot of times, kind of like you said, it's going to require people who are on the same page about this thing. Like, for instance, you guys might disagree about what you would consider. For instance, I saw Professor Simmons shaking his head when you were talking about strangling the rapist. Maybe you think that's something that probably should be taken into someone's own hands. Perhaps he doesn't. So then,
No, I forget my personal opinion. I don't think you should go in there and strangle a rapist. I don't think that's
well,
true.
right.
No, I mean, we think alike legally speaking.
Right, but what I'm saying is that some people would say that's justifiable. I'm not going to convict that, even though according to the law that person should go to jail.
Right.
I'm not going to convict it because I can understand where that person's coming from, for whatever reason.
You understand that furious anger as you look at your kid day after day, can't eat her breakfast, throws it up on the floor, jumps out of her skin every time a car door slams. Maybe she was stuffed in the trunk.
Right.
Maybe left to die.
Yeah.
Who doesn't understand that?
We're not on trial here.
I mean, I'm just merely, I know where we are. People understand that.
Right.
And they're angry. And what they really think is that the judicial system fails the victims. Because, hell, you know what the most you can get for raping my daughter? Who knows?
I have an another question.
No. We'll get to that in a second. What's the most you can get for stealing my daughter's dignity and raping her and screwing her up for the rest of her life?
10 years?
That's it? Only 10 years. That's it. Crazy. I can get drunk and unintentionally run you over and kill you, and I can get 8 years. Now, how does that make sense? So the whole system is on its head, believe me. And the reason it's on its head is because you've got professionals, as Rick would call them, legislators, who don't know shit from shinola. That's the real truth. That's why the criminal justice system is such a mess. And anybody, that's not debatable. It is a mess. It's the greatest mess in the world, but it's still our mess. And it's tons of room for improvement. And without jury nullification, we'd be done. Who else had a question?
So I understand the argument for jury nullification. I guess my concern is, in our criminal law class, we learn a lot about retributivist and then utilitarian.
Well, I'm sorry, so you're speaking to what?
Retributive and utilitarian views.
Retributive meaning punishment?
You punish those who kind of mess with the balance of moral order to bring them back to balance. Utilitarian, you punish if it's based on a societal good, like if it's good for society. So if you're nullifying, if the jury has the power to nullify, I'm just thinking if the person is already assumed to be guilty and this person goes out and they kind of have this repeat offenders, but they have a mitigating circumstance, say like they're angry because their daughter got raped, isn't that more of a sentencing question, like kind of like the type of punishment or the amount of punishment?
Yeah, only if you get convicted. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a sentencing conviction question if you get convicted. But I guarantee you there are going to be juries that aren't going to find that offensive.
And that doesn't concern you?
Not even remotely. Why should it? It would concern me if they couldn't do that.
I mean, doesn't it concern you that can turn around and happen to someone else's child too?
Here, listen, the question is, I hear you stating it is. I represent somebody, some bad guy.
Who's guilty?
As hell. He gets nullified and he goes out and does it again. Those are not the candidates that are likely to get nullified. I'm sure they exist, but what I'd rather...
Why wouldn't they?
They might, but they're not going to be very sympathetic. The kind of people that get nullified are sympathetic, that a jury with their 12 collective heads, whom the professor here doesn't think has the collective judgment to do anything, but really does have the collective judgment to figure it out, come to a conclusion about what makes sense and what's right for this case, not for justice, not for law and order, not for some esoteric concept that we debate at Moritz, but what makes sense in this courtroom. And if you take that out of the hands of the jury, we're lost. That's all I'm saying. And Professor Simmons would agree with that if I had to put him on the stand and cross-examine him.
So
He'd agree.
Decisions based on the moment rather than the future implications.
Right. Listen, it's like when I'm standing there with a client and I'm imploring a judge to do the right thing. I say, Judge, don't sentence the crime. Sentence this offender. What's important about this person? Make a judgment that relates to him. Now, the problem that judges have is that they are beholden to everybody else, to the electorate, to the cops, to who knows who. But the reality is juries are beholden to nobody, and that's the beauty of the system.
It's not necessarily beautiful, though. I mean, they can also make decisions based on bad reasoning.
And it happens, and there are
And
cases...
that's not reviewable at all.
That's right.
There's no way to
That's true.
fix that. There's no way to train them, no way to guide them in that way.
True. And that's why we have people who are convicted of capital crimes who have been executed by juries, right? Who are innocent, not arguably innocent.
But that's a separate issue. We're not talking about innocent people getting convicted. We're talking about guilty people who walk free, maybe for the wrong reason.
What we're talking about here is the power of a jury. And what you said was that... Yes, sir.
I was just going to ask what your thoughts were about jury nullification around more white-collar crimes and in terms of finance.
Yeah, I'll tell you who deserved a nullification was Martha Stewart. And you talk about a hosing, right? What did this woman do that was so wrong? Nothing, right? But because she was Martha Stewart, she got reverse nullified. She got vilified. She got jury vilified instead of nullified, right? Poor little Martha Stewart worked her ass off, got a TV show, she's a cook, she's got good taste. She gets some shitty little stock tip, and we paid it to prosecute her and put her in jail, right?
Well, her shooting little stock to throw off the entire market.
It did not, don't you know, please. And that's the biggest bunch of federalist BS I've ever heard.
Great argument for that.
Okay, please. What was your question again?
My question is, what do you found about jury nullification in the realm of more white-collar crimes, especially with like...
Well, listen, most white-collar criminals, like the Madoffs of the world, you talking about those people? Nobody's going to have any sympathy for them. You don't see those people. Who gets nullified? Sympathetic. People that are sympathetic to 12 jurors, or maybe 1 or 2, as Rick points out. But the problem is there's no way to separate the wheat from the chaff there. Now, what I hear Professor Simmons saying is that, gee, maybe we shouldn't have unanimous juries. Did anybody hear that coming from him? I think I heard that. I think I heard a little smidgen of that.
Not all, I mean, we sometimes don't have unanimous juries. Not all juries are unanimous.
Well, mercifully, in this state,
In this state we do.
it requires unanimity. So anyway, what other questions do you guys have? Dave Clark?
Yeah, I have an example.
Are you looking at your computer?
Yes.
Okay.
An example of a more sympathetic criminal than probably the rapist, murderer. In this case recently, I don't know if everyone's familiar with it or not, but Kelly Williams Boulard, pronunciation, from Akron.
Oh yes, my classmate prosecutor, Sherry Bevins. Yeah.
Sherry Bevin Walsh. Yeah. She was a professor. You're not familiar with this?
No, we still go into
Yes. She was a parent in
A black parent,
a black female, yes, who had
single mom trying to raise 2 kids, right?
2 kids, lived in Akron, and Akron school, some from Akron's. Public school system's not great there, and so she lied kind of on her forms and stuff.
Not kinda. Lied, manipulated,
Yeah,
forged.
She lied, forged stuff to change her residency so that her kids could go to Copley, which is kind of a suburban school sort of. And she was prosecuted and she was convicted, and currently it's being now reviewed. I guess it's created kind of some national attention, but I kind of want to use this as an example of maybe challenging the idea that like the system, whether the prosecutor or governor or these other tools in the system are going to be able to maybe let off a more sympathetic character who has technically broken the law. The prosecutor, Sherry Bevin Walsh, in this case, still afterwards is saying she falsified documents, engaged in many different acts of deception. Basically, it sounds like just trying to be sort of strong-handed as a prosecutor. Now, Governor Kasich is reviewing this, but even he's said this is not going to be an instant thing. It's going to be a few weeks before his legal team issues recommendation.
And more important, Kasich's wife is on the bandwagon, as I understand from today's Dispatch article. That was a little whispering in his ear that really got him fired up.
Yeah, so just to use this as an example, especially if this does potentially, if she is let off by the governor, why wouldn't it be an example that a jury ought to have been able to initially make a decision on this, and why they should not have that power to do that?
Let me ask you, why are you think she should not have been prosecuted, or she should not have been convicted or punished for this?
I don't know all the details of it, but I probably as a juror would be sympathetic.
Okay, so you think this is something that shouldn't happen. So the question is then, why? What is it about this case that you think deserves no punishment, even though we know she's guilty, that she does not deserve to be punished for her crime?
I think probably where some of its sympathy comes from is an idea that it's somewhat, her plight is somewhat sort of system created because of the school district she lives in.
Right.
Her children are going to be said she doesn't have money, she can't send them elsewhere, and
right.
Sort of. I think that's kind of the idea of what we play up to a jury, is that this is someone who is kind of at the mercy of a system.
Right. So in this case, I mean, and I agree the system, you know, if we think this person didn't deserve lawful punishment, then the system broke down at some point. Assuming the governor doesn't give her some kind of pardon, then the system has not worked the way you want it to work. So I would still go back to the question of how is best to fix this system? How do we fix it so people like this don't get convicted of these crimes, right? What's the best way of doing it? is the best way to somehow encourage jurors to more often look at non-legal, sort of tangential, maybe sympathetic issues, or is the issue or in this case, is it better to look at whoever, this wasn't a police arrest her, I assume, but some investigator, fraud investigator in the government tracked her down, decided to go after her. Okay.
Starting the school board problem.
Okay, yeah. So is that what we're trying to fix? Should we try to fix the prosecutor who thinks that we should make an example of people like this and is wrong in doing so? Should we fix the governors who almost never use their pardon power? Maybe we can fix that instead. There's a lot of things we can fix about this to fix this problem, which I think can be fixed. But that's my point. We can try and fix it if we see the problem here by training police or the school board or the investigators, by electing new prosecutors or by if you're running the prosecutor's office, to train prosecutors to not do this kind of thing, or to demand of our executives that they actually do, which they haven't done forever, as far as I can tell, actually have a pardon system that actually makes sense.
And who gets skewered in the interim while we're trying to fix it?
I'm not saying this is all perfect. I think it's not.
I realize.
But I'm not sure. But I think that, again, the worst thing we can do is to fix this problem is to now say to all the juries, well, just so you know, you might prove case beyond a doubt, but if any of you think this shouldn't be a crime, go ahead and let her go. I think that's the worst thing you can. I know. But the question is, how do we change the system? We change the system to make jury nullification less likely or more likely?
Well, give an instruction on it. Say, hey, folks, you do whatever the hell you want.
I'd like an instruction that actually says if you do this, you'll be guilty of contempt and you could go to jail.
Okay.
You never prove it, but I would tell you that. But the question is it really the best way to solve that problem? To open it up so more jurors can nullify, so they don't have to follow the law? Is that really how to fix this problem? Or should we have something more targeted towards the other players in the system that we can actually try and fix what happened? That'd be my response.
Okay, hold on, wait a minute. This woman back here.
Okay, I have two questions. The first is, presenting this as like this horrible thing that can terribly happen in the criminal justice system, but I'm wondering what the actual incidence of jury nullification is, how often it happens, and maybe this hasn't been done. To just sort of determine how often. And I guess my second question is, if you agree that these, for example, in this case, maybe it should be a civil penalty rather than a criminal penalty. So we'll say that's fair. These laws that are going to aren't going to be drawn to the attention until you have cases like this, or if you have systemic-wide, like for example the drug cases and usually, if it's true that we can fix the system and the system hasn't been fixed, how long? Like we have 50 years of over-prosecuting and jailing minority people until we say, oh, okay, I guess now the jury can take it into their hands, or is there ever that breaking point?
Well, there are two questions. The first question is, how does this happen? It doesn't happen very often, as far as I can tell. Maybe you have more.
No, it's right.
But I think it does hang juries an awful lot, more than it should, and that's just a waste of everyone's time. So as far as whether or not it happens often, no, it doesn't really do the good effect we're talking about very often, but it sure does waste a lot of time and money along the way. So that's another
Whose time really wastes? Some judges, some lawyers? Who cares?
It's a lot of money. And the money could go to hiring more public defenders.
Could go to giving OSU law scholarships. Could go to a lot of things. Money ain't the issue.
Time.
You can't put a price on justice.
Resources. The money's not getting justice. You're getting a lot of wasted time. So these resources are being misused because of this. The second question is, how long do we have to wait? And I don't have an answer for that. I don't know how to. I think any way of trying to reform the system is going to take time. And any time, go ahead.
How long must I wait? Blame it on a simple twist of fate. It's a very famous line. And that's what Professor Simmons doesn't mind happening to the hapless sap who doesn't get nullified. That simple twist of fate, that convergence, that acrid heavy hand coming down on this poor woman who's now a misconvicted felon.
Acrid heavy hand.
And what is her great sin? She wanted to get her 2 kids into Copley. Gee, shame on her.
Can we also...
Oh, hold on here. I got a federalist that's angry. Go ahead, stand up and tell me why you're angry.
What?
Because her sin is falsifying over 70 government documents.
Oh, 70, 7-0?
These poor hapless people are factually guilty of crimes.
The poor white people in Copley are educating 2 poor black kids from Akron. That turns my stomach too.
That's not what she's being. That's not why she's.
Of course, that's why she's being prosecuted.
These are all people who have committed a crime and are guilty. So,
I dare say Rick Simmons' kids aren't struggling to get into Copley.
She's not being convicted of sending kids to a school. She's being convicted of falsifying documents.
Precisely what she's being accused for doing what a mother should do.
Oh, see.
That would be my lot, right? Wouldn't that have been a pretty decent close? Bring motherhood into it? Oh, you're fuming. I can't wait to see you in a courtroom. You're going to be a little hellcat prosecutor. Can't wait. Stand up, wait. I'll be about 60 by the time you get really rocking, but I'll still have some energy left. Okay, where were we? Somebody else had some good questions. Oh, the moderator.
Can a juror be punished for either nullifying or, for example, if they don't disclose I'm an ex-felon and they go on a jury anyways? Can they be punished for anything like that?
Sure. Perjury, because you take an oath before you're voir dire.
What if they believe in nullification, they don't admit to that during the...
Well, as Rick astutely said, I mean, how you going to figure that out? It's like Chappelle says, my idea of reasonable doubt is a lot different than yours, right?
It's like that great thing called Call It Twice now.
Exactly. What is a great skit? It's a great video. One of my favorites, actually. Everybody's seen it, right, with the digital key? No? Oh, my God. Yes?
Have you had a case nullified?
Oh, yeah, I've had some nullifications. Not many, but some. Some. They're few and far between. You got to read, and I've tried hundreds of cases in this jurisdiction, and others. And nullification is, this is a fun argument, but the reality is, it rarely happens. You've got to have somebody sympathetic as hell, and the jury's got to know it.
And I think sympathetic judge too, like you said. Somebody's
Yeah.
going to let you maybe get away with getting, because you have to get stuff to the jury that they're not supposed to.
Any
really know.
lawyer worth his or her salt is going to get all kinds of inadmissible stuff in. Otherwise, they shouldn't be practicing law. Okay, you're either going to get it in through the pretrial publicity with the press, you're going to get it in through your own mouth and opening statement, you're going to defy the judge and say it when you shouldn't. That's what you're going to do. If you have any backbone at all. And if you're going to stand out there with your hand out and take clients' money, that's what you should do.
I teach evidence now, they're not going to take the class anymore. It seems
Oh, no, it's highly relevant, believe me, because I'll wrap the rules of evidence around my favorite prosecutor's neck here if I have to. But if they're not working for me, I'm going to ignore them. Next question? Okay, it's been a great audience. Thank you very much. We've enjoyed it.
Thank you.